Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. In the meantime, please make sure that you're sharing the video on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you can post it on social media, and we'll be starting shortly. Welcome, comrades and friends. We're going to get started now, and I want to welcome everyone to Workers' World Party's weekly live broadcast, where hundreds of revolutionaries from across the world gather to strategize, to analyze, and to build the struggle for a socialist future, for a workers' world. Tonight, we have a really exciting panel of active members of Workers' World Party. I'm going to be the host tonight. My name is Ted Kelly. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. And I just want to start tonight with a quote. And it goes like this. At the moment that the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium, the turn of the fascist regime arrives. Through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion the masses of the crazed petty bourgeoisie and the bands of declassed and demoralized lumpen proletariat, all of the countless human beings whom finance capital itself has brought to desperation and frenzy. From fascism, the bourgeoisie demands a thorough job. Once it has resorted to methods of civil war, it insists on having peace, and the fascist agency, by utilizing the petty bourgeoisie as a battering ram, by overwhelming all obstacles in its path, does a thorough job. Now, that was written by Leon Trotsky in 1932 in an essay called What is Fascism and How to Fight It? And we know through history that it was the working class. It was the Red Army of the Soviet Union and the thousands and thousands of revolutionary resistance fighters that defeated the Third Reich, while the liberal capitalists and the liberal democracies of Europe either collapsed or collaborated with the Nazis. It was the revolutionary guerrilla fighters who mobilized the Cuban people from the Sierra Maestra to Havana, who overthrew the CIA-backed fascist government of Fulgencio Batista in the 50s. It was the indigenous-led workers' movement in Bolivia that overturned the fascist coup there just last year. Everywhere you look in history, the lesson is clear. The only way to defeat fascism is through mobilized mass mobilization of the working class. Here in Philly in 2018, there was a protest, a demonstration by the Proud Boys. And this was at a time where they were only beginning to be taken seriously as a threat, as a white supremacist group. And Philly showed up in a massive organized mobilization that was planned by our branch, working in coalition with many of our allies, months in advance of this demonstration. We outnumbered the Proud Boys almost 1,000 to 1. But that day, which was very invigorating and exhilarating because it showed the strength of the working class, there was an act of violence that started that day, and it was committed by the police. They attacked the anti-fascist demonstrators in a show of force before any of the right-wing Proud Boys even showed up. So the lesson I learned that day is that as terrifying and growing a threat the fascist threat is, the immediate and most organized violence inflicted on our class is inflicted on us by the bourgeois state, by capitalism. Over a dozen Philly police and transit cops have been identified as participants in the January 6th storming of the US Capitol, including a QAnon conspiracist Philadelphia detective whose job is to do background checks on new recruits for the police force. We're gathered today to talk about this fascist menace and the aftermath of that January 6th fascist coup attempt. So without further ado, I want to say, please make sure that whether you're watching on Zoom or Facebook or Twitter, to please share this event and share the link so that more people can join us. But now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're going to be joined tonight by Larry Holmes, who is Workers' World Party's first secretary. Larry was recruited to the party through militant resistance to the Vietnam War and the anti-war, anti-racist, anti-brass American Servicemen's Union. We're also joined by Tanya Siddiqui, pronouns are she and her, from the Dallas branch of Workers' World Party. Tanya is a comrade of South Asian descent who has been working with many comrades across Texas. We're joined by Diane Mathowitz of the Atlanta branch of Workers' World Party. Diane is the host of the Labor Forum on WRFG 89.3 FM, a retired auto worker from UAW number 10, local 10. Diane worked on the GM assembly lines for 30 years. We're joined by Ed Childs from Boston. Ed is the retired chief steward of Unite Here. Ed's an organizer of the 1974 March Against Racism to stop the fascist movement against integrating the Boston schools. And finally, we're joined by Tom Mansweeney, he, him, from Workers' World Buffalo, the city where our party was founded. I want to remind everyone that while most people are watching on Zoom, if you could take a second to go to Workers' World Party's Facebook page and share this live video with your friends, share it in your Facebook groups. That would really help us enormously to reach more members of our class. And that's what we're trying to do tonight. We also encourage you to share your comments at Workers World on Twitter. We're also live on YouTube for all the YouTubers out there. And for all of you on Zoom, please add your pronouns and city so that we can refer to you correctly when you type your questions in the chat that we're going to be taking at the end of our broadcast tonight. We're going to start with a few questions, and then you're going to hear less from me and more from our speakers. But I want to start by asking this. I want to start, comrades, by talking about your reactions to this fascist insurrection last week. We saw that the forces who stormed the US Capitol were armed and organized white supremacists. But what was the class character of this fascist insurrection and the people who participated in it? Let's start with reactions. And I wonder if, Larry, if you want to kick us off.
Yes, good evening, comrades. Always love to share the platform with my comrades, different generations, different parts of the country. Well, when you consider what's happened since January 6th, I'm not talking about the impeachment. That's another question. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to comment on that. But you see Washington, D.C. is pretty much shut down under martial law, occupied by the army. That may be going on in other areas of the country. My feeling as a communist is, instead of relying on the cops and the army to protect us from these fascists, from these white supremacists, I'd rather see the formation of large-scale anti-fascist workers' defense committees. I hope you all take note of that, because we may very well need to begin organizing that once it is clear how real the ongoing threat of violent, racist, white supremacist, fascist attacks are. On the character of fascism, very, very good, learned Marxists, such as the one that you mentioned in your opening remarks, have studied the origins of fascism in Europe and elsewhere. And they tend to zero in on the same points. A fascist movement is a symptom of a deeper capitalist economic crisis that the owners of capitalism do not have a solution to, a crisis that is making it harder and harder for the politicians to govern in the normal way. And the crisis is either or holds the potential of awakening the working class and creating the basis for a major working class upsurge in the struggle against capitalism, an upsurge ultimately of revolutionary dimensions. So hence, the purpose of fascism, as we understand it in studying its history, is to stop the working class from fighting and from challenging capitalism and from making revolution and taking over by dividing the working class, by confusing and disorienting or demoralizing it, and in some instances, smashing it physically, its organizations and its leaders and its militants. The bottom line, the growth of fascism, and whether it succeeds or whether it's defeated, is directly related to the readiness of the workers and the oppressed to fight the capitalist system. If the working class, for whatever reason, is not up to it, and there's a vacuum, and one could argue that describes the situation to some extent that we have in this country. This is the most dangerous situation regarding fascist developments. What is our response? Every genuine leftist, every militant, every socialist, communist, even anarchists who are oriented toward the workers and the oppressed, we've got to work together like never before to rebuild the working class movement. And I'm not just talk about it or be for it or have it in our literature, which is fine, or waiting for someone else to do it. I think that what happened in the Capitol last week and many other things before that, it's the handwriting on the wall. We've got to do whatever we can to rebuild a fighting working class movement. We can't waste time, and we can't wait for someone else to do it. This is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of strategizing. It's going to take a lot of organizing. I think most of all, it's going to take whatever it requires to win over the best militants in the Black Lives Matter movement in this tremendous uprising against police terror and racism that we've witnessed and been a part of over the past 6 or 7 months in this country, to win them over to a stronger working class, revolutionary working class perspective. And Workers' World Party is dedicated to this. And this is what we want to talk about more tonight.
Thanks, Larry. It's a great way to start our conversation tonight. And the same day that the insurrection took place, we finally received the election results of the Georgia election. I'm wondering, Diane, if you'd like to talk about the connection between those two events.
Okay, and let me just first start off maybe a little about the first question. I think like most people, I had been very much aware that this rally was going to take place in Washington on Wednesday, the same day that the Congress was going to, accept and declare Biden as the winner of the president's election. And I had a schedule of things to do, and just by happenstance, turned on TV just at the moment when the storming of the Capitol steps happened. And me, as along with probably many other activists, have been at many demonstrations in Washington or at our own capitals or whatever. And even when we were only going to be, a few hundred, if that, the place would be lined with cops. There'd be helicopters overhead. It would be all of this stuff. So I have to admit, when I saw how easy it was for this group, to break windows, break into the Capitol, make it all the way to the Senate and House floors, I was taken aback. I have to admit, I was surprised. I was not surprised by the organization that was evident, because we've encountered that here in Georgia and in the past and not so long ago. I do think that part of the intensity, perhaps, of some of these white supremacists was, in fact, the fact that Georgia, which had been a very reliable right-wing red state, had just elected not only the first Black senator from the state of Georgia, but also the first Jewish senator from the state of Georgia. And so that really, got them based on their own anti-Semitism and their own racism. And I also want to comment on that, is that those elections of those two men who had espoused much more kind of progressive views and had both participated in Black Lives Matter demonstrations, for example, was the result really not so much of the Democratic Party machinery here in the state of Georgia, but really was the result of what I would describe as all of the mass organizations and communities that really just wanted to get rid of Trump and all of his minions. And they worked really hard, both in getting new registrations among youth, particularly of color, worked hard with the women's community, the migrant community. I mean, it was really an amazing kind of effort at the grassroots. So I have no doubt that, besides the fact that Trump had lost, that these two other senators from Georgia also part of what made them so angry. I guess I'll talk a little bit later, because as I said, we've seen this kind of violence here in the South. I've lived in the South for over 50 years. And so a lot of this is not surprising to see armed, white, racist men rampaging.
Thanks, comrade. Tonight we have a series of questions that I want to ask, and give all of our speakers tonight an opportunity to answer. But I'm wondering if Tanya or Ed or Tom, if you have any reactions to our first question about just sort of your general thoughts on the fascist insurrection that took place last week before we move on to our next question.
Yeah, when I saw this on the news, as someone I'm in law school, so a lot of lawyers are the gatekeepers of the oppressor's power. And I wondered how this would perhaps empower people to not just say things in class, but to see the sort of movement work that they would do outside of class. There's an organization at my school called the Federalist Society. And I see like discourse now arising, kind of validating white supremacist violence. There was a question actually today in class about whether white supremacists should be allowed to practice law. And then someone was making the argument like, yes, absolutely. And so I think for people who are joining the webinar tonight who may not be a part of an organization, I think it's really, really crucial that you join one and build the organization that you join, hopefully Workers' World, because it is something to be taken seriously. And I think it's really important for people to note certain conversations that are taking place within their networks or outside of their networks. And it's really, really important for people to pay attention to their own response to what happened at the Capitol. Because while, of course, I think it's something that perhaps all of the panelists saw coming, at least I was very surprised at the level of, white supremacist violence that was like overt, and then the response to it being like, okay, well, we're just gonna resume doing whatever it is that we were doing after this event took place.
Yeah, very good points, Tanya, especially that I've only myself learned about the Federalist Society in recent years, but holy smokes. Yeah. Now we see them all over the federal courts as well. Tom, did you want to talk about your reactions as well?
Yeah, sure. We've seen the steady escalation of fascist violence over the past 4 years. So in some ways, I guess to me, it was predictable. What wasn't predictable was that they actually got into the Capitol. That shows a level of that shows a break within the American bourgeoisie that the main political forces behind Trump and the GOP were willing to break democratic norms that much, if we can even call them democratic, but those of a liberal representative democracy under capitalism, that they were willing to go in and just let all that shit happen. That surprised me. I would have expected 5 people to die on the streets, not inside this building, which is supposed to represent the United States all across the world. So that, I think, well, we'll see it later in the conversation, but it reminded me a lot of the beer hall putsch. And in that sense, I think maybe it shouldn't have surprised me, just being someone who's read some history. But I guess seeing it happen now and in my lifetime is uncomfortable.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to be shocked. Ed, would you like to say any of your sort of preliminary responses to this fascist insurrection before we move on? And just remember to unmute, Ed.
All right. Yeah, I've seen this in the 70s. I've seen it in other countries. That in 1974, when they were going to integrate the Boston school system, the fascists, these same elements, organized thousands of people. I remember that the summer before school opened, they had 2 demonstrations of 20,000 people in Boston itself. And they marched downtown, and any Black person downtown would be assaulted. And the assaults would be supervised by the police. That was a fascist movement. It showed that the connection between racism but that was the actual fascist movement. They also had demonstrations every weekend in white neighborhoods, some up to 7,000 people, but most around 1,000, which is a lot for Boston. So it's the same elements of people. It was a lot of police, a lot of lawyers, petty bourgeois, larger landlords and store owners, but a lot of workers were also. They weren't so much leaders of it, but they were suckered in to get 20,000 people in Boston. That's a large section. So we've seen it here before. We've dealt with it before, and we've defeated it before, which we can go in later.
Yeah, that's very important to acknowledge, Ed, that, historically we have seen this, and really in some of the historical comparisons we can draw, like Tom mentioned too, are one of the reasons for alarm. Comrades, I want to talk about why the bourgeoisie needs fascism, and what are the root causes of these insurgencies that we have seen in the 1920s in Germany, that we've seen in the 1970s in Boston, that we're seeing now, across really the world, because US-backed coups we've seen elsewhere. We've seen the growing similar movements in Hong Kong, in India, in Hungary, in Poland, in Ukraine. I mean, why is this happening right now? And why are we seeing so many of these examples? And Tanya, I wonder if you want to talk about some of the sectarian violence in India and other elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it's an act of desperation by the ruling class, because you see how capitalism is at a decline, or right now they're doing whatever they can to maintain their power. So by going to like these very desperate acts. Like in India, you have a lot of sectarian violence, Muslims being targeted primarily by Modi's administration. And that's something that was present at the coup, or whatever we want to call it, at the Capitol. You saw Indian flags, and there was a lot of discourse I saw on Twitter and then other media, like people on different media sites saying, well, you know, who does this person support, or who do these people support? Who could it be? I mean, it's clear because of Trump and Modi's relationship and how closely the US is now working with India, building up their energy sector, or at least looking like they're building up their energy sector. So I think all of this is to maintain a level of power. But then you can also see violence, not just in India, but then across the border too. Like in Pakistan, I just recently wrote about the Hazara people in Pakistan and how they're targeted and are the ongoing genocide with their community. That's also a form of sectarian violence. They belong to the Shia community, and Pakistan is a predominantly Sunni country. But then if you look at this, if you're following where like the resources are and where the money goes, the Balochistan is very rich with resources, but what they do is they extract all these like coal, granite, and there's just like different minerals that are very precious that they will then transport to the more wealthy portions of the country, but then the people never see any of that. And that's why I think it's very easy to disappear workers. And that's why it's so important for workers to really mobilize now, is because you can see that there's like an attack on our class, and the fascists will kind of go to any means in order to maintain their position as it currently is.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. Tom, did you want to also jump in on, you know, or any other panelists? Like, why does the bourgeoisie need fascism? Why are we seeing it so often now?
The bourgeoisie need fascism for a couple of reasons. They need it to counter the influence of the left and of labor by extra-legal means, which they themselves can't do with their own hands to respect their own norms and ideals. There's also the need for them to maintain super exploitation. Super exploitation is the extraction of labor and resources from a people that is greater than what they can actually sustain and still grow, still maintain their own populations. And we see this in the United States with many US minorities, primarily Black and Indigenous people, but also several other ethnic groups. And even that can get a little bit fuzzy, like when we're talking about Latinos or Chicanos, and where exactly they fall between Black and Indigenous. And really the answer is both. But that's kind of why they need fascism, and what fascism accomplishes for them is it makes this level of extraction sustainable, because no one would tolerate that if by themselves, or at least as an ethnic group, they already inherently had the political power to overthrow that within their own place. They need to be outnumbered and specifically targeted by a motivated group of people representing the interests of a majority.
Thanks, Tom.
I would add this too, that, you know, bring it down to the historical realities and the historical significance of United States imperialism. A form of fascism has always existed in the United States, especially in the US South. This was white supremacy, which was not just a cultural thing or a subtle thing, but law, a way to keep Black and brown people down and in their place, so that white supremacy would be reinforced. And it was also splitting the working class and that in and of itself is, as Comrade Diane could tell you, it's worth a webinar. Many books have been written on it, and it's an important thing to study, because you don't. It's good to go to Germany and Italy. You know, the classic examples of the development of fascism that a lot of Marxists and a lot of other good people have focused on to study and understand fascism. But U.S. imperialism has its own form of fascism, and what we're seeing now is it sort of morphed into something bigger, you know, that can't be defined by a region, the South or the Midwest, you know, and also it's developing at a time when U.S. imperialism is losing its status as the head of the global empire, and also the standard of living of many people who not so long ago considered themselves to be middle class. You know, there's no class struggle in the U.S. That's the BS that they give you. We're a big middle class country, you know, and a lot of the masses brought into that, but something happened to them, you know, during globalization and neoliberalism and union busting and the downsizing of wages and the pauperization of, you know, the majority. They're realizing that their status is crumbling, and larger and larger sections of the masses are freaking out. In some ways, we shouldn't be surprised that, especially in a vacuum, and what I mean by that, there not being enough of a radical anti-capitalist revolutionary working class fight back that has gravity. You know, in the absence of that, this social crisis creates a vacuum. And I don't think we should be surprised that white supremacists and fascists would fill it, because, as they say, you know, nature abhors a vacuum. But it informs what we have to do, comrades and friends. We've got to start organizing in a way that we haven't before. It's my observation that very good comrades in the struggle, different organizations, whether they're no organization or not, their hearts and minds are in the right place. They're against capitalism. They see the need for socialism. They hope that it will arrive, you know, while they're still around, or at least for the benefit of the next generation. But when it comes to actually coming together and doing something serious that could change the situation, they get a little shy. Well, we're too weak. Our numbers are too small. Let's talk about it, but I don't know whether we can really do anything. And if I'm right, if that kind of psychology is part of the movement, we have to warn everyone that's not helpful right now. We've got to abandon this notion, whether it's conscious or semi-conscious or whatever, that we can't do anything. History is demanding that we do something. What happened to the Capitol, the election of Trump, and so many other things are signs. They're warnings. We revolutionaries have to get our act together. And we have to deepen our base in the working class and help workers organize. Most of the workers are not organized. The organized labor movement has 8 or 9%. Most of it in government, I think. You know, they've lost over many decades a lot of organized workers. So we start from that reality that, you know, 90% of our class is not organized. 90% of our class is not even, some of the people in our class don't even realize that they're in the working class. You know, a lot of young people who've got, you know, bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctorate degrees, but can't get good jobs. And, you know, they don't realize as of yet, although their consciousness is in transformation, that they're part of the working class, maybe even vital parts of it. You know, the migrant workers, you know, the labor movement, the organized labor movement, let's face it, let's be honest, it hasn't opened its arms and welcomed migrant workers. If the case was otherwise, the level of the migrant workers would be different. They'd be, fighting shoulder to shoulder, and it would be harder for someone like Trump or whomever in the bourgeoisie to scapegoat them and beat them down. So now we've got to look at all of these issues very, very closely and very hardly. And at the end of the day, and we're in the 11th hour, we have to come up with a plan to organize our class. And as I said earlier, and I'm sorry I'm harping on this, but I see the handwriting on the wall, and you can't deny lessons when they're in your face. Either we start doing something positive and radical to organize our class on a level unprecedented in the history of this country. Something like the 30s, if you want an analogy. Either we begin doing that, or our situation and the situation of the working class is going to sink deeper and deeper into crisis, and there'll be cause for greater fear of the rise of fascism and also the intervention of the state, which works hand in hand with the fascists. So now's the time. Now's the time. We'd like you to join our party. We call ourselves Workers' World Party because we are a party of working people. But whatever, you've got to take that big step forward. We can't just be worrying about it. We can talk about it, but even that's not enough. We've got to come up with a strategy to rebuild a revolutionary working class movement. And no matter how weak you may think you are, I'm telling you it's possible if we start.
Comrades, I mean, if you, and friends and comrades, friends who I hope become comrades, if you like what you're hearing tonight, if what you're hearing from Larry and Tanya and Diane and Ed and Tom makes sense to you, the time is now to join a revolutionary organization. We are Marxist-Leninists. We are Marxist-Leninists who have organized into a party in the belly of the beast, in the center of empire, of US empire. And I strongly recommend, if you're listening to this right now, and if what we're saying makes sense to you, go to workers.org/join, fill out the join form, and one of us, an organizer, will be in touch with you ASAP. The time is now to get involved. And I just also want to make a quick announcement. Workers' World Party has been operating a newspaper for decades and decades, and we have a book that we put out recently, one of many, many books that are available. This is one that has writers from Workers' World newspaper, as well as Ajamu Baraka from Black Alliance for Peace, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Vijay Prashad, Margaret Kimberly, Max Blumenthal, Lee Soo-hin, and the late Kevin Zeese. They've all contributed to this book. It's called Capitalism on a Ventilator. It's about the impact of COVID-19 in China and the US. You can buy this book, despite Jeff Bezos' attempt to censor it. You can now buy this book. It's available for sale. And it really goes into, why capitalism is collapsing, especially compared to successful socialist states like People's China. So I really recommend you check that out. I like one thing that Larry just made me think of. The last time I was able to speak with Mumia Abu-Jamal in person, we talked about fascism, and he specifically pointed to Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, the destruction of Reconstruction by this mobilized, the Ku Klux Klan and this white, not all of this white fascist movement. The people who made up the Klan, not all of them were like the elites in the slave state, but they were whites who were dependent on the survival of the slavocracy and that mode of production. There were not enough slave owners to fight and form the Klan, but they were able to mobilize the petty bourgeoisie, the people who depended on that system. And that's why, we saw this fascist movement against the movement of Reconstruction. And, that's like such a clear case. We see this was capitalist decline in the fall of slavery and a fascist resurgence to restore what it could. And, we know that the working class is the only class that can defeat fascism. And Diane, I mean, you have experience fighting the Klan firsthand in the 20th century. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I wanted to make a comment in the beginning before I talk about some specifics. We're talking about how we need to develop the have the working class as recognize its class obligation and its possibilities. And one of the things I was thinking about, because I was in Buffalo for a number of years, and we mobilized against a fascist, women-hating Operation Rescue. We have organized demonstrations all across the country against fascist or racist elements, Ku Klux Klan, Nazis, other white supremacists. We've organized, anyway, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that we call things like the civil rights movement, or we call it the women's movement, or we call it the immigrant rights movement or something. And what I think we need to say is that every single one of those were workers' movements on an issue, not necessarily recognizing their class, but that's who it's always been. So I want to first say that workers, regardless, have always taken on the obligation, the charge to fight against all forms of oppression and exploitation. So to me, it's a sort of the challenge that Larry offered here is, how do we meld all those elements of the working class and have them realize that they're a class that's fighting together? So be that as it may. All right, so, okay. All right, so here in Atlanta, as we've been here, the branch has been here since the early 70s. And we've had the opportunity to actually chase, I'm talking physically chase, Ku Klux Klan out of the city of Atlanta. And it hasn't just been here. Oftentimes, our comrades have been asked to go to small towns in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, to help the residents of that town, the people who live there, who are being confronted by violent white supremacists. So we have seen exactly what we need to see on a national scale, which is that workers can come to a conclusion about how to organize and fight back against even the most violent armed groups. And certainly during the history of what's called the civil rights movement, the Black liberation struggle in the South, we can even talk about the Lumbees and people in North Carolina who fought the Klan with guns. And that's not the only instance of that. So I'm just trying to say is that the reason it can be daunting. This for many people is a new experience of seeing this kind of organized right-wing assault on anything, but that it's very, very clearly is something that our class is capable of doing, and that we as members of a communist party, as members of other organizations, have the capacity to help push forward to victory. So, as I said, we have in the party brought thousands of people out against right-wing anti-abortionists, against in Boston, against people who were opposing the right of Black children to go to schools. Here in Georgia, we've gone against armed Ku Klux Klanners and Nazis in any number of towns and cities, including here in Atlanta. And as I said, I think it was '89, the thousands of largely youth literally chased them down the street, even though there was over 1,000 cops protecting them. I'll close with that.
Comrade, that is a beautiful image. of seeing the Klan on the run. Before we move on, I'm wondering if any other comrades want to talk about, why is it that the working class is the class that is best suited to defeat fascism? What are the material reasons for this?
I can speak to that.
Yeah, please.
The reason why only the working class can defeat fascism is the material basis on which fascism exists, which is to oppose the working class. We're the primary antagonists to fascism. Super exploitation is something which is inflicted upon a sector of the working class, and likewise is that act which makes the entire class weaker. Not only can we be the only ones who can defeat fascism, we're the only ones who have any interests or anything to gain in doing so. The bourgeoisie don't have anything to gain from defeating fascism. They may be able to gain from reining it in, from keeping it corralled, from keeping it in their pockets until they need it to be a little bit more out there and a little bit scarier. But they never want to get rid of it entirely. They'd be disarming themselves.
That really is like, yeah, please.
Say, capitalism depends on division in the working class. The working class depends on solidarity. So that's the key. The workers will only get their rights if there's solidarity, and the capitalists will only get their profits if there's division. So fascists are a tool to keep people divided and scared.
That's right. I mean, fascism is the sledgehammer that the capitalist wields to smash up the working class. So to fight fascism is to fight the person wielding the sledgehammer, this go ahead, Ed. Yeah.
Yeah. I have something to tie what Comrade Tanya and Larry and what's going on here. I participated in both the Irish struggle and the South African anti-apartheid struggle, and there was a remarkable situation there. Obviously, to keep the colonial situation alive, they need a loyalist fascist base, which obviously in South Africa was the white population, and in Ireland it was the loyalist Protestant population, and but there was a remarkable thing that happened fairly similar time, because it was a world economic crisis, that there was a 16% unemployment rate, both in the white South Africans and also the loyalists in Ireland. And what had happened, because both the ANC and the IRA and Sinn Féin were extremely strong and moving, they started to recruit a lot. The ANC said they never recruited so many whites as that period of time. And also the IRA, people I interviewed in prison on the IRA, a lot of them were ex-loyalists. So there is the capitalists have to buy the movement off, but also our side has to be extremely strong to pull them back. And it's also a situation that I'll talk about later in 1974, but in our struggles against fascism, we do it two ways. One, we go with strength, which we've been talking about, but also issues, working class issues. We go with jobs, not racism. We go with healthcare, not racism. We go with education and not war. So we appeal to the economic needs that the working class needs at the time. So that's it.
That's an important point too, Ed. I mean, and look at the situation we're in now, with millions and millions unemployed, partly because of this pandemic, but because also capitalism is in decline. That's why we can't, get back to work. And yeah, I think, the time to recruit all members of our class is now. I do want to ask comrades about this white fascist movement. And I think there's a lot of confusion about the character the class character of who attacked the Capitol last week. You know, are the people who stormed the Capitol, are they just disgruntled white workers, or is the fascist movement different than that? I think it's important to clarify this. What do comrades think?
Sorry, Ted, could I just add one thing
Please,
to
yeah.
the last question? When everyone was giving their response, I started thinking about how important, in order to fight fascism, I think it's really important for us to construct what that means. And I think whenever we ask for historic examples, I think oftentimes, especially with our education system in this country, you know, we don't learn history as it truly is, right? So with people who are joining us tonight, I think one thing to also talk about whenever raising class consciousness is political education is huge. So something that I think is important for people to understand is that joining an organization will also provide those materials, right? Like in order to understand the US's position as an imperialist nation, well, what does that mean? And then looking at that from a historical perspective and then drawing those lines and connecting it to what we see today. I just wanted to add that whenever we're talking about the worker struggle, that I think framing something in a historical context really does call for political education as well.
That's such a crucial point, Tanya. I can speak personally. I know I have learned more in my time in the party from comrades, through our newspaper, through the books that we put out, through struggle in the streets than I learned through years and years of schooling. Truly, truly. Like
school never taught you about the MOVE bombings. Like once I joined the party, then, that's whenever I started learning. Even Mumia's, like the Free Mumia movement, I did not know about that before talking to comrades. So I think it's really crucial for people whenever we're talking about even like, perhaps this is a bit off topic, but whenever we're talking about police abolition, I think it's really important to understand how police only serve the ruling class, and then also who are they or what are they protecting, right? Like it's just private property, but to contextualize that, I think it's really important to look at sort of the formation of the police from slave patrols, chattel slavery, and then talking about modern day policing and then modern day enslavement of human beings in the carceral state that we have in this country.
Right on, comrade. Yeah, I mean, it is never off topic to discuss the police when we're talking about fascism, right? And yeah, comrade, I can tell you, I grew up in Philadelphia, went to public schools here. I did not once in any of my classes did I learn about Mumia Abu Jamal or the move bombing.
There's something just to the question that I think you asked a little while ago about, what's the social composition of these fascists? A little bit of everything you hear about the composition of the fascists is probably true. Again, we're talking about the United States and its own unique experience, not another part of the world at a different point in history. What understanding the South and the oppression of Black people, of African American people in the South will teach us is that certainly there were dirt poor white people who had nothing, who were swept up into the Ku Klux Klan and supporters of white supremacy, and led to believe that even if they had nothing, at least they were better than the Black people, and they were willing to fight and sometimes die for that. And that just gives you to understand that that's very real and very true about consciousness and white supremacy in the South. Our view is that that's not a a natural thing that's reversible. But this is what the ruling class in the South imposed on the population. You know, don't ask for more from the boss. Just be happy and satisfied that you're better off than your black neighbors somewhere down the road. So, you know, hold on to that, you know, and they did it to break the working class movement, which is historically why the South, even at the height of unionism, the rate of unionism in the South was small by comparison. This is why wages in the South. Now that's changing now with globalization. You know, in many ways, you know, the economic and social conditions that were once in the South are now all over the country. You know, that's part of what's happening to global capitalism. But so understanding that, you understand the backwardness, the basis for the backwardness of some white people. But on the other hand, there's no doubt that many of the people, if not most of the people who voted for Trump, you know, on average, have an income, you know, that's above the average of most workers. And that's not to mention the tremendous support that Trump still had, at least of a few days ago. I think the bourgeoisie has been jumping ship, you know, because his boat is no longer viable, it's sinking. But when he was doing good for them, and, you know, and they thought he was doing good for them, he had a lot of support on Wall Street. He had a lot of support of the CEOs. Now they're sort of closing the door and, you know, cutting ties, you know, but that's a political development, you know. I know one of our comrades, I think, is writing an article, you know, if she hasn't already done it, about how one of the things we should look at is all these businesses that are being closed. You know, they were in trouble anyway, and the pandemic has basically, you know, pushed them out of existence. And we have to be concerned about that, not only because this means tens of millions of workers are losing their job, mostly low-paid workers, many of them whom disproportionately Black and brown workers, disproportionately women, I should add. But you have a lot of small business owners, you know, white small business owners running around, you know, caught between a rock and a hard place. And might they be fodder for an appeal to fascism? Yes, but I'll come back and end with the vacuum. This is the most dangerous thing. The fascists are dangerous. The white supremacists are dangerous. They have guns and they're willing to do all sorts of things, and that can't be underestimated. And they have nothing to do but run around having, you know, military games somewhere in the woods somewhere, and who knows what they're prepared to unleash. But compared to the united working class, they're very small. They're not the real threat, in my view. The real threat is the weakness in the working class movement, a weakness that can be overcome. When the working class is united and starts to wake up, we can flick the threat of fascism away like a speck on our clothes, I think. Because comparatively speaking, there is no comparison. What is the vacuum? Let's break it down. You know, sometimes we talk about the need for a general strike. There were even some unions who boldly stepped forward when there was concern that there was going to be a coup, you know, that did not just involve a ragtag group of white supremacists with support from the police and the army, you know, but with a section of the bourgeoisie supporting Trump, which would make the coup attempt, that would make it a lot more serious and on a different on a different level, you know. Imagine if the organized working class movement or some new working class movement, and I think it's going to be a combination of both. Imagine if we were to organize a day of mass protests for something as basic and as simple and as popular as raising the minimum wage. Millions of workers would come out. The only problem is that right now unemployment is so high that the demand for a job might equal the demand for a raise in the minimum wage. We'll figure that out. But have you seen such demonstrations? The leaders of the labor movement haven't done it, and there's a reason why they haven't done it. And it has to do with the fact that they're basically conservatized, status quo, attached to the hip of the Democratic Party, and not seen as a movement, but seen as something that is just fossilized and, not of much value to the struggle against capitalism. That's not set in wood or dyed in the wood. We have to change that. One of the things we have to do is open up a struggle both outside and inside the organized labor movement to force that movement. And the rank and file will hear us. It's the leadership that's the problem. To become a militant, anti-capitalist, general strike, fight like hell movement, and not just some excuse for a movement that's tied to the Democratic Party. That's part of our work. I guess I raised the idea of the demonstrations around something as basic as the minimum wage, because we're always talking about general strike. That would be something, wow, imagine a general strike, even a 6-hour general strike or a day general strike. We can start on a very basic level. Call out the workers on any progressive issue to demand COVID relief, to demand unemployment relief, with very small exceptions. Tell us, where have you seen the labor movement, especially at its top echelon, do this? It doesn't happen. Why is that? That makes no sense. And the point I'm trying to make it is that the extent to which those who call themselves the leadership of the labor movement do not mobilize workers, do not do what's necessary to create a healthy, fighting, militant, anti-capitalist, working class movement, that creates the vacuum. And the white supremacists and the fascists, they take advantage of that. And it makes them seem bigger than they are. That's a temporary thing if we do our work.
Comrade, I feel like that's also a perfect segue to a question that I want to ask Ed about, if you could tell us about the successful way that you were able to mobilize workers, against racism in the struggle you were talking about in 1974 in Boston.
Like I said, there was an economic decline. The civil rights movement had won the right to integrated schools in Boston, which was the last major city in the country to do so. And the racist movement had a hold on Boston like no other city. And they mobilized huge. My job actually in the movement at the time was to infiltrate that movement. And so one thing that I got to notice, especially what Larry and others have been talking about, is their appeal to the white workers. How did they bring them in? Because they couldn't have had that movement. They needed 20,000 people on the street because they know the civil rights movement could also muster people. And so they did it by kind of like Trump is doing, xenophobia, extreme racism, that with an innuendo saying that, oh, they're stealing your jobs. You don't have a job because of this. You don't have a job because of that. You're going to have better education than them. These are all implied. And they make sure that all their literature and everything is implied. Now, the problem with them is that they only can do that in a vacuum, as Larry was saying, because if there's opposition, they're in trouble. So we organized the opposition. They had a 20,000 people demonstration. They were organized in the neighborhoods. We did too. And we ended up with 25 to 30,000 people, led by the Black community, and showing huge unity. With the only issue, the main issue that we had was we say no to racism, which was also an innuendo to everybody that this is unity, that we're going to fight for everything under unity. And who made up the other side? Well, it's the same that makes up this. The police was a big part of that. I'd say when they had 20,000 people on the street, at least 1,000 of them were police. Large landlords, lawyers, priests, and a lot of petty bourgeois, but then they suck it in a lot of workers who had, like Larry was saying, there was no place for them to go. And in their ignorance, they went to the fascist movement. Well, when we had 25 to 30,000 people on the street, there was a place for them to go. There was a very interesting thing. We went into the diehard racist areas, 5:30 in the morning, and leafleted. We did have security, but what we wanted to do is reach the workers in that community. And who's out at 5:30 but the workers? And so in the subway, we did that. It was some of our best recruiting tools. 5:30 in the morning, we recruited a lot of those workers who were in the racist areas to come join with us. So that's what, and I'll tell you, we had that march. It was very strong. The police actually attacked it, and we pushed the police back. And there wasn't one demonstration in Boston till today of a large fascist movement. That stopped it in the tracks. So that's how you do it. There was a thing that we were looking at. One, build up the Black community and the Latin community and the progressive community by doing this strength. But there was also another thing we were looking at, which how to undermine the fascist movement. Now, we analyzed that they do have the leadership and they have their elements in it who benefit, but then you also have the workers who do not benefit from the fascist movement. They think so by innuendo. We went after them. We called them the workers on the fence. They were on the fence. They were basically all they were looking for, who's the strongest, and they go to whoever the strongest is. Well, when we became the strongest, a number of them, I wouldn't say a lot, but a number of them came to us and became organizers with us. Most of them became neutralized. And that's what the struggle does. So I think that's a big lesson for today too. There was and how to get that done? You got to organize. You got to do deep organizing. We organized tenant unions. We organized unions. We organized not door to door. We organized on the subway. We organized workers as they went to work. That's how it's got to be done. We had little demonstrations, and it was dangerous. The security we had were very tight. When we were leafleting in subways, we had 10 people, 7 on security, 3 leafleting. You got to do it. And there was just one thing that I wanted to raise with that is that when we did that and we totally neutralized them, they weren't able to respond at all. The movement in Boston was so much stronger. The Black community, leadership in the Black community really strengthened, and you can see it till today. Black politicians, who there weren't any at that time in Boston, started to get elected. It changed the whole atmosphere. Obviously, everything we did hasn't been undone, but we need to build that again.
Thanks, comrade. You know,
I wanted to raise something that the famous quote by the fascists that comes out of Germany, that every anti-fascist has run into, which is how did the fascists flourish? Well, they have to defeat us. And what did they do in Germany? The quote is by a minister that says, first they came after the communists, and I did not help them because I wasn't a communist. Then they came after the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't help them. Then they came after the trade unionists, and I didn't help them. Well, that's similar to today. To get organized, most of the unions have been organized by communists. To organize this stuff, you got to be tough. You got to be a communist. The Jews at that time, that's xenophobia and racism today. And the unions are the unions, and it's whether they're organized, unorganized workers, whatever. That's what's gotta happen. So there's no different than what was happening in Germany. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. It's these conversations too that it's why I love Workers' World Party, and why I'm proud to say that I'm a communist, and that I'm proud to be on the front line against this struggle. And I'm proud to say I'm a communist, and I just like hearing all the comrades talk, the analysis and the history and the strategy. It's like, I'm ready to go out tonight and get out there, comrades, we're about 9:15. I just want to make a couple announcements and then make sure that we get to our last questions and have everybody have a chance for closing remarks. One thing that is important, critical, for any, party like ours is our newspaper. This is one of the fundamental things that makes us Leninists, right? And I'm really happy that we have resumed printing the physical copy of our newspaper, Workers' World. We're now having monthly print issues after temporarily suspending the hard copy production due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have still been putting out a weekly issue on PDF, and we have for months now been putting out the print issue again on a monthly basis. You can subscribe at workers.org. You can get the physical copy, or you can subscribe to our email newsletter. And I also just want to plug the Patreon too. If you go to patreon.com/WWP, you can subscribe to be part of our prisoner subscription program. Workers' World provides a free newspaper subscription to anyone who's currently incarcerated. And, Tanya mentioned the prison industrial complex, and we've talked about needing to organize every sector of the working class. We have millions of our brothers, sisters, and siblings behind the walls in prisons, and they deserve our solidarity just like every other sector of the working class. So I would encourage you to support the subscription program that way as well. Comrades, this, I think, for the sake of time, I think this can sort of be our conclusion, question. If you want to make your closing remarks, sort of addressing what we do now. We have seen living examples of the alive fascist movement just last week. And we are talking about what working people need to do. Should we wait for Biden to save us? I have a feeling comrades know the answer to that question. But please, comrades, I would love for everyone to sort of make some closing statements before we round out our evening. Tom, do you want to kick us off?
Yes. Biden obviously can't be relied upon for anything, nor the DNC. They will use whatever resources they are promising to limit the threat of fascism, in fact, against the left. We've seen minimal arrests from those involved in the storming of the Capitol, less than even I would have expected, considering just how their own democratic norms have been just kind of torn apart. They're still doing nothing about it. They're still, the dominant narrative coming from DNC leadership is one of unity and bipartisanship. They stand for nothing, and they certainly won't stand up for us. So we need to defend ourselves. We need to organize, we need to study, we need to make friends and allies and coalitions, because it's not just the communists whose neck is on the line. It's the whole working class, and it's oppressed people, it's anarchists, it's people who are liberal and just maybe working class and inconveniently in the way of the fascists, whether or not they're leadership, or rather I should say, and not leadership specifically. And we also need to be prepared to defend people acting outside the law, or maybe even, understand that the law itself is there to stop us, and sort of understand our relationship to the law can't be so strictly defined. When fascists came to Buffalo and organized in Cazenovia Park, demonstrating in Cazenovia Park, people I know personally beat the crap out of fascists. I saw people getting their tires popped. I said nothing. I certainly wasn't going to let the cops hurt those people. I wasn't going to do anything to uphold a legalist stance in fighting fascism, unlike liberals who were present. And that's what we do as communists. We understand that bourgeois law does not protect us, and it's primarily used against us.
Thanks, comrade. I want to encourage anybody else who wants to make some quick final statements before we wrap for tonight.
Ted?
Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I want to say something that happened in our union, Unite here in Boston. Two of our Black members were brutalized by the police in a city, Lynn, outside of Boston. And we organized around it. So we organized a group of 500 people, 100 union members, and 400 community organizers and community people in Lynn. We marched, had a very militant march to the police headquarters of Lynn, where they mobilized all their police forces. We did win. We got the charges dropped on the members. We got a couple of police fired. But important things that happened was the people in Lynn loved it. And we had some new organizing drives in some of the hotels. And it turned out to be some of the people lived in Lynn and seen what Local 26 did and joined in, because they seen the struggle against racism being picked up by the local. They seen it was very strong. And these issues, these militant issues, help build a coalition. I think everybody's been talking about a coalition. We have to have a coalition, but you're not going to have a coalition if you don't fight about all the issues. So that's an example I wanted to raise that we had done here in Boston.
Thanks, comrade. It's very important. I wish we had more time to discuss this particular issue too, but one of the questions that we did have is how much is this fascist movement intended to counter the Black Lives Matter movement, which you better believe is a working class movement, a massive millions strong rebellion of the working class.
Remember,
we saw just last year. Yeah,
that's somebody put in the chat that the Democrats were responsible for the election of Trump. And I agree with that. The Democrats' abandonment of the working class, especially after the 2008 global financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession, the Democrats, holding tight to neoliberalism and globalization. That was the vacuum. That was part of the vacuum. And the leadership of the labor movement, more or less going along with them, that was part of the vacuum that Trump became a lightning rod for a phony lightning rod for the anger and for, the anti-system rebel against the system sentiment. That's over. So now we have an opportunity as revolutionaries, especially as revolutionaries who believe that the working class and the oppressed is the social factor that can make history, that can change history. Now it's time for us to enter center stage and help develop the working class movement, that, they'll be talking about the working class movement, the real working class movement, and not some phony white working class racist thing, or the white supremacist, or the boogaloo something, or the Proud Boys. But, we'll be the ones that are making the news because we're organizing our class. Again, a lot of times there's a feeling, whether even revolutionaries are able to admit it, that we're kind of helpless and we're dependent on somebody else doing something. And, maybe that's reasonable, as you assess the situation, what you can do, what you can't do. But we definitely have to move away from any notion and any energy or perspective that we are powerless. We have to inhabit the opposite of that and believe that our work going forward is the answer, is the solution, no matter how much work it takes, no matter how long it takes. We've got to start doing it and start doing it. I hope that in, upcoming webinars, we'll be able, that is, Workers' World Party will be able to put forward some of its concrete ideas and strategies, and we have them. We can't talk about them tonight because tonight's almost over. But this is our time to come together. And I'll tell you this, the whole world is waiting for the workers and the oppressed of the United States to rise up. They're waiting for it because even though the empire is dissolving, it's still, by comparison, the empire, and its tentacles strangle people all over this globe. And they're waiting every place, in Africa, in the Middle East, all throughout Asia, throughout Latinx America, in Europe. They're waiting for the workers of this country to rise up, because they know that almost as much as an uprising of the working class that is sustained, and any uprising anywhere has a global effect. That's part of the development of capitalism, bringing us all close together. But here in the belly of the beast, they know that if we start acting as a class and taking things into our own hands, this will really shake up capitalism and imperialism and give new revolutionary hope to people everywhere. And so it's not just the people where you live in your city and state, and even in this country. The people of the world, comrades, are waiting for the working class in this country to do something. It's a big charge. I recommend we accept it.
Well said, comrade. I want to, just before we close, Diane or Tanya, I want to give you a chance to make any final remarks.
Well, I actually had thought about it, but now I think I can only echo this, that all of us who have been in the struggle, from the period of the civil rights movement through all of the many movements that have altered this, the social, society of the United States, changed consciousness, developed our own. I mean, we all have to talk about where we came from, what you were talking about. Each one of us was not born with this consciousness. It had to be developed, and it gets developed through the struggle, and it gets developed through the relationships you have with people who are committed to the struggle, who don't just come there for a little while and then fade away. And so I certainly credit that, and the fact that I have been able to see with my own eyes, massive movements of immigrant workers who shut down, large cities. Black Lives Matter, that made a difference so much in this country and was supported by hundreds of demonstrations around the world who recognized the critical issue of racism and white supremacy. The women's movement. I could go on and on. LGBTQ, the trans movement, and of course, workers. You know, it's often talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, about what an incredible feat that was, both of organization and determination. But let's look at who it was who refused to ride buses and those who helped with their own cars. It was workers, Black workers for the most part. It was workers. And yes, it was called, was a big situation with the civil rights movement, but it was a workers' movement that took up, it was the workers who took up that. And so I'm just saying that, in my opinion, because of the real social conditions, millions unemployed, long food lines, continued attacks on all manner of oppressed people, that we have this opportunity. And I just hope that everybody who's listening tonight, watching tonight, and everyone that we encounter in all our different branches and cities, that we help seize the time. There's never a better slogan, seize the time.
Thanks, comrade.
I just wanted to add one quick thing. I think, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, and people can feel very isolated because, we aren't organizing how we would without like this COVID-19. So yeah, everyone knows that we have this going on. But what I'm hoping that people who may not be party members or candidates, or maybe you really haven't worked with the party, build where you are and the people will help. So I think it can feel like, okay, well, I have, this feeling like, and listen to what you're feeling too, because you should not be working till death, literally. If you think about how Amazon workers are treated, how people at UPS, this is not something that is human, it's not. So, and if you feel this way and there are questions that you have, or you want to build not just your political education, but maybe you want to help organize workers in your community or at your job, wherever you are, reach out, because there will be a group of people from our party who will help you build.
That's such a good note to end on, comrade. I just want to say, first, I want to thank all of you, Tom, Ed, Larry, Tanya, Diane. This is such a great conversation. It's always an honor to be with comrades for these conversations. And, to everybody listening, we are going to be here again next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, always on Thursdays. But you don't have to just join us for 90 minutes once a week. You can join Workers' World. And if you like this conversation, you want to hear more from Workers' World Party and our other great comrades and all the allies that we have in the movement, you can check out our new book, What Road to Socialism. You can buy it online or download a copy for free at workers.org. You can see our book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, which, just looking at the table of contents, you see how many great revolutionaries and activists and organizers we work with. Like Tanya said, wherever you are, reach out and you will have an ally in Workers' World Party. And I know that you have heard this strategy, your duty. We all joined the party for a reason. And I really want to invite people who are those on the fence folks that Ed talked about, join us. But thanks, comrades. Thank you all. And thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. We'll see you again next week. Build a Workers' World.